The courtroom was enormous. James Carter sat in a metal chair surrounded by glowing blue walls that hummed with energy. These weren't regular walls. They were force fields designed to keep prisoners from escaping. 2 alien guards stood on either side of him. They were HFY warriors, massive creatures covered in crystal-like armor that reflected the cold lighting of the room. Their eyes never blinked as they watched him. James looked around slowly. The courtroom rose upward in circles, like a giant spiral staircase made of seats. Hundreds of aliens from different worlds sat in those seats, all staring down at him. Some whispered to each other. Others just watched with cold, calculating eyes. A few looked disgusted. He was human, and apparently that was enough reason for them to hate him. He kept his face calm. At 58 years old, James had learned not to show his emotions. His hair was mostly gray now, cut short like it had been during his military days. The orange jumpsuit they made him wear felt ridiculous, but he didn't complain. Complaining never helped. Above him, holographic screens displayed his charges in a dozen different alien languages. He couldn't read most of them, but he knew what they said. Unauthorized interference. Violation of the non-interference doctrine. Disregard for galactic law. The list went on. His lawyer sat next to him, a bird-like alien named Tess. Her species was called Velian, and her feathers kept changing colors based on her mood. Right now they were shifting between yellow and orange, which meant she was nervous. Really nervous. She kept tapping on her electronic tablet, scrolling through legal documents like she was searching for a miracle. "Mr. Carter," she whispered, leaning close. Her voice came through a translator device that turned her clicks and whistles into English. "Please, when they ask how you plead, just say not guilty. That's it. 2 words. Don't explain anything. Don't tell them why you did it. Just let me handle the legal arguments." James shook his head slightly. "Can't do that. I did what I did. Not going to lie about it." Tessa's feathers flashed bright red. "That was anger or maybe panic. That's not how this works. You need a defense strategy. You need..." A deep sound filled the room like a gong being struck. Everyone went silent immediately. 7 judges entered through a hidden door at the front of the courtroom. They wore long robes that seemed to flow like water as they walked. The head judge was tall and thin, with blue and purple skin that shifted colors as they moved. Their face was angular and strange, with large silver eyes that seemed to see everything at once. "This court is now in session," the head judge announced. Their voice echoed through the entire chamber without any microphone. "I am High Arbiter Kelvin. We are here to determine the guilt or innocence of the human called James Michael Carter. He stands accused of unauthorized intervention in the Talos System territorial dispute." A reptilian alien stood up from the prosecutor's table. His name was Vycross, and his green-black scales caught the light as he moved. He was Zenthari, a species known for being cold and calculating. Perfect for a prosecutor who wanted to destroy someone's life. "Your Honors," Vycross began, showing rows of sharp teeth as he spoke. "The evidence against this human is overwhelming. He willfully violated the non-interference doctrine. He entered the Talos colony despite explicit warnings from both governments claiming that territory. His actions undermined months of careful diplomatic negotiations." "He saved 300 families," Tess interrupted, jumping to her feet. "The colony was about to be..." "Order." Kelvin's voice cut through the courtroom like a knife. "Counselor, you will have your turn to speak." "Prosecutor, continue." Vycross smiled wider. James had seen that kind of smile before. It was the smile of someone who thought they'd already won. "The defendant has a history of this behavior," Vycross continued. "He believes he is above the law. He thinks human morality is superior to galactic order. Today he evacuates a colony without permission. Tomorrow he might decide an entire government is corrupt and try to overthrow it. This is why humans are dangerous. They refuse to respect boundaries. They refuse to follow rules." The holographic screens lit up with video footage. James saw himself on his ship, giving orders to his crew. Shuttles flying down to the colony. Families being loaded aboard. Weapons platforms in orbit powering up, getting ready to fire. Every action he'd taken was technically illegal. Every action had also saved lives. "How does the defendant plead?" Kelvin asked, those silver eyes focusing on James. James stood up. Tess tried to grab his arm and pull him back down, but he gently moved her hand away. "I did what needed doing," he said clearly. His voice was steady, calm. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Vycross made an exasperated gesture with his clawed hands. "Your Honor, the defendant must enter a proper legal plea. This is..." "I did what needed doing, Your Honor," James repeated, looking directly at Kelvin. That's my answer. That's my plea. That's the truth. Kelvin stared at him for a long moment. Something changed in those alien eyes. Was it surprise? Recognition? James couldn't tell. The record will show a plea of guilty with justification, Kelvin finally said. We will hear the prosecution's opening arguments. As Vycross began presenting his case, the holographic displays changed. Now they showed James's complete military record. His full name appeared in huge glowing letters above the courtroom floor. James Michael Carter. His rank. His service number. Lists of missions he'd been on. Medals he'd earned. Wars he'd fought in. Kelvin leaned forward suddenly. The change in posture was dramatic. The other 6 judges noticed and looked at their leader with confusion. Kelvin's hand gripped the edge of the bench so hard that his knuckles changed color. James noticed but didn't understand. He'd never been to the Dreamer home systems. He'd never met any of their judges before. Why would his service record matter to them? Then Kelvin did something shocking. The high judge stood up from their seat. Immediately, the other 6 judges stood as well, following some kind of protocol James didn't know about. Then something even stranger happened. Throughout the massive courtroom, aliens started standing up. First one, then another, then dozens. A Velian delegate. A KRYL military commander. Others from species James didn't even recognize. The prosecutor stopped talking mid-sentence. Everyone was standing now except James and the guards. The silence was complete and overwhelming. Kelvin's voice was thick with emotion when they finally spoke. This court recognizes James Carter. James had no idea what was happening. But he was about to find out why his name meant something to these aliens. Why his past was about to change everything about this trial. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. James Carter stood there completely confused while hundreds of aliens remained on their feet, all eyes on him. His lawyer Tess looked like she might faint. Her feathers had turned pure white, which apparently meant total shock for her species. High Arbiter Kelvin's hands were shaking slightly as they gestured toward the holographic displays floating above the courtroom floor. 40 standard years ago, Kelvin began, their voice carrying a weight that made everyone listen even more carefully, I was not a judge. I was nobody important. Just a clerk, a minor legal assistant fleeing my homeworld during the Frontier Wars. The holographic screens shifted. Now they showed an old damaged spaceship, its hull covered in burn marks and holes. Warning lights blinked red across its surface. The ship looked like it might fall apart at any moment. Our ship carried 2,000 refugees, Kelvin continued. Their voice cracked slightly with emotion. Families, children, elderly people. We had escaped the invasion with nothing but our lives and the clothes we wore. But our ship was dying. Life support was failing. We had maybe 3 hours before everyone aboard would suffocate. James felt a cold sensation in his stomach. He was starting to remember something from a long time ago. We sent distress calls on every frequency we had, Kelvin said. We begged for help. Ships passed us by. Military vessels had their orders. They couldn't break formation. Civilian transport said the debris field we were stuck in was too dangerous. Everyone had their reasons. Good reasons. Regulations. Safety protocols. Chain of command. But the result was the same. We were going to die and nobody was going to help us. The holographic display changed again. Now it showed a younger version of James, maybe 28 years old, wearing a worn military uniform. He was standing on a ship's bridge that looked like it had seen better days. Then a human relief convoy received our transmission, Kelvin said, looking directly at James. Their commanding officer was a lieutenant. His name was James Carter. He had orders to proceed directly to a military staging area. The regulations were absolutely clear. But this man looked at our situation and made a different choice. James remembered now. He remembered that day like it was yesterday. The distress call coming through. The debris field full of shattered metal and radiation. The desperate voices on the other end of the transmission. The decision that had cost him almost everything. Lieutenant James Carter redirected his entire convoy, Kelvin continued. 6 cargo ships. 2 escort frigates. 1 medical transport. Everything he had. He spent 18 hours in that debris field pulling people off our dying ship. His own flagship took serious damage. Hull breaches. Engine problems. 3 of his crew members died when a cargo bay lost pressure during the rescue. The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Even Prosecutor Vycross had stopped objecting. But he saved 2,000 lives, Kelvin said, their voice breaking. He saved my life. He saved my daughter who was only 5 years old at the time. He saved my people when everyone else had given up on us. The dreamer judge reached under their robes and pulled out a medallion hanging on a simple chain. It looked like a crystal star that glowed with its own inner light. This court recognizes James Carter as a holder of the Dreamer Star of Mercy. Only 12 non-dreamer beings in our entire history have received this honor. It is our highest civilian award. The defendant is not a criminal standing before us. He is a hero to the dreamer people. The courtroom exploded with noise. Aliens were pulling out their communication devices, accessing databases, checking records. Vycross stood frozen at his table, his carefully prepared prosecution materials forgotten. A Velian representative stood up in the gallery, her feathers bright gold. Our records show the defendant also holds our silver wing of compassion. He delivered medical supplies to our colony during the blockade of Ven 20 years ago. Our people were dying of treatable diseases because both sides of the war wouldn't let aid through. He ignored both militaries and delivered the medicine anyway. A massive Caerwello warrior rose from his seat, his crystal armor chiming as he moved. James Carter bears our medal of worthy opposition. During the fourth incursion, when our forces were fighting against his military, he treated our wounded soldiers. He requested a prisoner exchange specifically so our injured warriors could receive proper medical care. He showed honor to his enemies. More voices joined in. A Threnic engineer whose research station James had evacuated before it exploded. A merchant whose family James had rescued from pirates. A young Zenthari colonist whose settlement James had supplied during a famine while governments argued about jurisdiction. Tess was frantically scrolling through her tablet as commendations and medals flooded in from a dozen different species. Official records. Verified accounts. Testimonials from grateful aliens across half the galaxy. Mr. Carter, Tess whispered, her voice full of awe. Why didn't you tell me about any of this? You have decorations from 12 different species. You're listed as a hero on half a dozen worlds. Why didn't you mention this in your defense? James shrugged, looking uncomfortable with all the attention. Didn't think it mattered. We're here because I broke the law at Talus. What I did 40 years ago doesn't change that. Objection. Vycross finally found his voice. Your Honors, this is completely irrelevant. Past actions do not excuse current crimes. The law must apply equally to everyone regardless of their history or their medals or their. Your objection is noted, prosecutor, Kelvin interrupted. However, this court will absolutely take into account the full context of the defendant's character and history. We will take a 2-hour recess while the bench reviews these materials. But before the judges could leave, Kelvin turned back to James. Lieutenant Carter. Or perhaps I should say Captain Carter, which was your rank when you were forced to retire early. James said nothing, but his jaw tightened slightly. You were discharged from military service not long after you saved my people, Kelvin continued. The official record says honorable retirement. But we both know the truth. Your superiors got tired of your independence. Tired of you breaking rules to save lives. They pushed you out. They had their reasons, James said quietly. I wasn't a good soldier. Good soldiers follow orders. You were an excellent soldier, Kelvin replied. You simply valued lives over regulations. And that made your commanders nervous. So they removed you from the military. And what did you do then? The holographic displays began showing more records. 40 years of incidents. Mining disasters. Hostage situations. Medical emergencies. Refugee evacuations. Over and over again the same pattern. James showing up where people were dying. James breaking whatever rules stood in the way. James saving lives that everyone else had written off as acceptable losses. You have spent 40 years doing the same thing, Kelvin said. You see people in danger. You see institutions failing them. And you act. Every single time. No matter what it costs you personally. That is who you are. That is who you have always been. The dreamer judge's expression was difficult to read, but there was something like sadness in their voice. The question before this court is not whether you broke the law, James Carter. You clearly did. The question is whether the galaxy can afford to have people like you acting on conscience instead of waiting for permission. Whether we should punish someone for repeatedly choosing to save lives over following protocols. Kelvin looked around at the other judges, then at the gallery full of representatives from dozens of worlds. We will reconvene in 2 hours. This case has become about much more than one man's actions. It is about the relationship between law and morality, between institutional authority and individual conscience. We do not take this decision lightly. As the judges filed out, the courtroom remained in chaos. Groups of aliens argued with each other. Some looked angry that a simple prosecution had become so complicated. Others looked thoughtful, reconsidering everything they believed about the case. James sat back down heavily. "That was a long time ago," he muttered. "I was a different person." "No," said a voice from behind him. Kelvin had paused at the doorway looking back. "You are exactly the same person. That is what concerns some beings here. And that is what should terrify the hegemony most of all. For 40 years you have not changed. You see suffering and you act. Every time. Regardless of the cost." The High Judge's silver eyes met James's. "The question we must answer is whether that makes you a hero or a threat. Perhaps it makes you both." During the recess, Vycross paced back and forth in a private conference room like a caged animal. His tail lashed behind him in anger and frustration. 3 holographic projections flickered in front of him, showing his hegemony political handlers. All 3 were talking at once, their voices overlapping in his translator. This was supposed to be simple, the senior handler hissed through the secure communication channel. Her scales were dark red with anger. "Make an example of human recklessness. Establish clear precedent. Show the frontier worlds that nobody is above the law." That was the plan. "I understand the plan," Vycross snapped back. "But nobody told me this human was a decorated war hero. Nobody mentioned he has medals from half the council species. Do you realize how this looks? We're prosecuting someone that half the galaxy considers a living legend. We're prosecuting a criminal," the handler insisted, her voice cold and sharp. "His past doesn't matter. Focus on the facts. He violated sovereign territory. He ignored explicit warnings from 2 separate governments. He undermined months of diplomatic negotiations. Make them see the danger of letting individuals act without authority." Vycross stopped pacing and pulled up James Carter's complete file on his personal display. The document was massive, hundreds of pages long. He started reading through it carefully, looking for any advantage he could find. After leaving the military, James had become what the file called a freelance crisis responder. That was a polite way of saying he went wherever there was trouble and did whatever he thought needed doing regardless of who told him no. The list of incidents was staggering. Collapsed mines on asteroid colonies. Hostage negotiations with pirates. Medical supply runs through active war zones. Training programs for local security forces. Refugee evacuations from conflict areas. Disaster relief after station explosions. The man had been everywhere, done everything. But what caught Vycross's attention was the pattern. Every single incident followed the same basic structure. James would assess a situation. He would determine that people would die if he waited for proper authorization. Then he would act immediately, breaking whatever laws or regulations stood in his way. The file included a statistical analysis prepared by Hegemony Intelligence. Estimated lives saved. Approximately 50,000 across 40 different species. Also included 17 violations of territorial sovereignty, 33 breaches of military protocols, 42 instances of unauthorized humanitarian intervention, and 107 formal complaints filed by various governmental bodies. "He's broken laws in a dozen different jurisdictions," Vycross muttered, studying the numbers. "But he's also never acted for personal profit. Never sought political power. Never used violence except in direct self-defense. Never chose action when waiting would have actually worked." "What was that?" the handler demanded. "Speak up." "Nothing," Vycross said quickly. "I'm reviewing the strategy." But the prosecutor's mind was working through the implications. Every single intervention James had made followed a specific pattern. He only acted when institutions had failed. When proper channels would have resulted in preventable deaths. When the choice was between breaking rules and watching innocent people die. And in every case, James had chosen to save lives. Vycross disconnected the call and sat alone in the quiet room. He had entered law to serve justice, not politics. But this case had stopped being about justice the moment those medals and commendations had appeared. When court reconvened, Vycross had his strategy prepared. If he couldn't attack James's character, he would attack the precedent. Show that one good man acting alone was still dangerous to galactic society. "Your Honors," Vycross began once everyone was seated. "The court has heard testimony about the defendant's heroic past. I do not dispute those facts. James Carter has indeed saved many lives. But that is precisely what makes him so dangerous." The courtroom murmured. This was an unexpected approach. "Call your first witness," Kelvin instructed. Vycross gestured, and a Threnic military commander approached the witness stand. His name was Talus, and his multiple eyes blinked in sequence as he sat down. Commander Talus, Vycross began, please describe how the defendant's actions affected your military operation 3 years ago. The Thrennic's voice was flat and professional. Carter entered a secure military zone without any authorization. His presence revealed our staging area to enemy forces. We had to relocate our entire fleet. 2 weeks of operational planning wasted. Significant resources expended. Potential intelligence compromised. And what was he doing in your secure zone? Vycross asked. Extracting refugees from a contested settlement. Tesh jumped up. Did anyone die because of the 2-week delay in your operation? Talus hesitated. No, but that's not. And did the refugees Mr. Carter was extracting survive? Counselor, that's beside the point, Vycross objected. The point is unauthorized interference in military operations. But Tess pressed forward. Commander Talus, how long would proper authorization have taken through diplomatic channels? The Thrennic looked uncomfortable. 4 to 6 weeks minimum. And would those refugees have survived that long in a contested zone scheduled for orbital bombardment? Talus's eyes looked away. Unlikely. The zone was marked for sterilization in 72 hours. No further questions, Tess said, sitting down with a satisfied expression. Vycross called more witnesses. A politician whose carefully crafted peace agreement James had complicated by evacuating civilians before negotiations concluded. A corporate executive whose mining operations James had disrupted by organizing worker safety protests. A station administrator whose authority James had undermined by distributing food during a rationing crisis. Each witness had legitimate complaints. Each could point to specific ways James had made their jobs harder, disrupted their plans, or ignored their authority. The testimony was technically damning. Every regulation James had broken was a real regulation that existed for real reasons. But each testimony also revealed the same uncomfortable truth. In every case, people would have died if James had followed proper procedures. In every case, the institutions had been willing to accept those deaths as necessary costs of doing business. Finally, Vycross called James himself to the witness stand. Mr. Carter, the prosecutor began, circling slowly like a predator. You've heard all the testimony. You don't deny your actions. No, James said simply. I did what they said I did. You knew these interventions were illegal. Yes. You knew you would face consequences. Fines. Imprisonment. Charges like the ones you face today. Usually yes. Yet you acted anyway. Every single time. Why? James was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Because someone had to. That's not an answer, Vycross pressed. There are proper channels for everything. Diplomatic processes. Legal frameworks for humanitarian intervention. Emergency protocols. Why do you believe you have the right to bypass all of that? I don't believe I have any special rights, James said. But when I'm looking at kids who are about to die because the paperwork hasn't been filed correctly, I'm making a choice no matter what I do. I can follow the rules and watch them die, or I can break the rules and try to save them. I've made my peace with breaking bad rules. I can't make peace with standing by while good people die for stupid reasons. So you admit it? Vycross said, his voice rising triumphantly. You place your personal judgment above legitimate governmental authority. You decide which laws are bad and which reasons are stupid, and then you act accordingly. That's the very definition of vigilantism. No, James said quietly. It's the definition of having a conscience. Conscience is not a legal defense. Maybe it should be, James replied, meeting the prosecutor's eyes. Laws exist to protect people. When they stop doing that, when they get in the way of protecting people, then something's wrong with the laws. Not with trying to save lives. Vycross turned to address the judges directly. Your Honors, you see the danger now. The defendant admits everything. He admits to placing his personal moral judgment above legitimate authority. Today it's a refugee evacuation. Tomorrow he might decide a government is corrupt and needs to be overthrown. Next year he might decide a species is dangerous and needs to be eliminated. Where does it end? When court reconvened after the break, High Arbiter Kelvin made an announcement that surprised everyone in the courtroom. Before we hear closing arguments, this court will exercise its right to hear testimony from affected parties. A significant number of individuals have requested to speak about the defendant's character and actions. We will hear from them. Vycross shot to his feet immediately. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The facts of the case are already established. We don't need character witnesses to are relevant when this court determines appropriate judgment, Kelvin interrupted firmly. We will proceed. The massive doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a deep grinding sound. A line of beings stretched into the corridor beyond. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. James turned in his seat and felt his chest tighten. He recognized some of those faces. The first witness was a valiant doctor named Rita. Her feathers were gray with age, but she walked to the witness stand with steady determination. Her voice was strong when she spoke. 20 years ago, I ran a hospital on the colony of Ven. A territorial dispute put us right in the middle of a blockade. No supplies could enter without approval from both governments claiming our system. That approval never came because neither side wanted to look weak by compromising first. Rita's feathers darkened as she continued. We ran out of everything. Antibiotics. Surgical supplies. Pain medication. Basic bandages. I watched patients die from infections that should have been simple to treat. A child died from a fever that any basic medicine could have cured. I was a doctor with a hospital full of dying patients and empty shelves. She looked directly at James. This man flew through an active military blockade in an unmarked cargo ship. Both sides fired on him. Both sides ordered him to turn back. He ignored every warning, docked at our emergency port in the middle of the night, and offloaded 6 months of medical supplies. Then he left before security could arrest him. Rita's voice broke slightly. He saved hundreds of my patients. Maybe thousands because those supplies lasted until the blockade finally ended. I never got to thank him properly. So I'm doing it now in front of this court. Thank you, James Carter. You gave me back my ability to be a doctor instead of just watching people die. The next witness was a KRYL soldier named Derek. His crystalline armor was covered in battle scars that had healed into interesting patterns. He stood at attention when he spoke, military discipline evident in every movement. Fourth incursion Talus Ridge, Derek began, his voice rough. My unit was cut off behind enemy lines. We had wounded. We were waiting for extraction that our command decided was too risky. They called us acceptable casualties. Wrote us off. Left us to die. Derek's hands clenched into fists. James Carter wasn't even part of that war. He was a civilian contractor working in the system on unrelated business. But he heard our distress call on an emergency channel. He came into an active combat zone. Alone. Under fire from both sides. He landed his ship and started treating our wounded himself. The KRYL warrior's voice grew softer. And I need you to understand this clearly. We were the enemy. We were the soldiers who had been trying to kill humans just hours before. But he treated our wounds like we were his own people. He stopped our bleeding. He stabilized our injuries. Then he negotiated with both our command and his own military for a prisoner exchange so we could get proper medical care. Derek looked at James with something like reverence. 3 members of my unit survived because of him. I'm standing here today because a human decided that enemy lives still mattered. That's not something my people forget. One by one they came. A Threnic engineer whose entire research team James had evacuated from a sabotage station before it exploded. A merchant whose family James had rescued from pirates while authorities argued about jurisdiction. A young Zenthari whose colony James had supplied with food during a famine while politicians debated proper channels. Each story followed the same heartbreaking pattern. Institutions failing. Bureaucracy paralyzing action. Politics trumping compassion. And then James appearing, assessing the situation with quick efficiency, and doing what needed to be done. An elderly Qualex woman told how James had pulled her grandson from a collapsed mine while safety inspectors argued about liability. A valiant teacher described how James had evacuated her school when officials insisted there was no immediate danger, 2 hours before a reactor breach would have killed everyone. A KRYL medic explained how James had donated his own ship's oxygen reserves to a station losing atmosphere, nearly suffocating himself in the process. The testimony went on for hours. Kelvin let it continue despite Vycross's repeated objections. The prosecutor tried to counter with his own witnesses. Officials whose authority James had undermined. Commanders whose operations he had complicated. Politicians whose careful negotiations he had disrupted. But their complaints sounded hollow and petty next to the parade of living, breathing people who wouldn't exist without James's interventions. Yes, he had violated protocols. Yes, he had ignored proper channels. But the alternative in every case had been watching innocent people die. As the afternoon light through the high courtroom windows began to fade, one final witness approached the stand. She was a young dreamer woman, elegant and composed, wearing the formal robes of a senior legal official. Please state your name and occupation, Kelvin said gently. I am Magistrate Elise, Senior Legal Advisor for the Dreamer Humanitarian Council. I specialize in interspecies humanitarian law. Specifically, I work on developing legal frameworks for rapid crisis response that can bypass political gridlock. And why have you come to testify today? Elise turned to face James directly. Her silver eyes were bright with emotion, but her voice remained steady and professional. Because 40 years ago I was 3 years old on a refugee ship with failing life support. My mother died in the initial damage that left us stranded. I had maybe 3 hours left to live. The courtroom went completely silent. James Carter saved my life that day, Elise continued. He saved 2,000 lives, including High Arbiter Kelvin, who has served our justice system with honor for 4 decades. He saved countless others who went on to have children, build communities, and contribute to galactic civilization. The ripple effects of his choice that day are incalculable. She addressed the 7 judges directly. This court is debating whether laws matter more than lives. But that's the wrong question. Laws exist to serve life. They're tools we create for that purpose. When they fail that purpose, when they become obstacles to protecting sentient beings instead of frameworks for protecting them, then someone must make a choice. Elise's gaze returned to James. You gave me a future, Mr. Carter. I have spent that future trying to build legal systems so people like you don't have to make impossible choices. I've worked for 20 years developing protocols for rapid humanitarian response. Legal frameworks that can bypass political disputes in genuine emergencies. International agreements that protect emergency responders acting in good faith. She smiled slightly. I've dedicated my entire career to making your actions unnecessary. To building institutions that respond with the same speed and compassion that you've shown. But that work isn't finished yet. Until our systems are as responsive as you've been, until our institutions value lives as much as you do, we desperately need people willing to make the choices you make. The courtroom remained silent as Elise stepped down from the witness stand. But she paused beside the defendant's table and spoke quietly so only James could hear. Thank you for my life. And thank you for teaching me what justice actually means. James nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the emotion. Just did what needed doing, ma'am? I know, she said softly. That's exactly the point. You didn't do it for recognition or gratitude. You did it because it was right. As the final witnesses concluded their testimony, Kelvin surveyed the packed courtroom. Representatives from dozens of species sat in contemplative silence. Even Vycross looked troubled, his earlier confidence shaken. 6 hours passed before the judges returned. The courtroom had remained completely full the entire time. Nobody wanted to leave. Beings from dozens of different species sat in tense silence, waiting for the decision that would define how the galaxy viewed individual conscience versus institutional authority. News feeds across known space had picked up the story. What started as a simple enforcement case against one human had become something far bigger. Debates raged on every civilized world. Some species demanded James be made an example of. Others called for his immediate release and commendation. The trial had touched something deep in the galactic consciousness. When the 7 judges finally emerged and took their seats, the silence in the courtroom became almost painful. High Arbiter Kelvin's expression was impossible to read. The other judges looked equally serious. James Carter, please rise. James stood slowly. Tess rose beside him, her feathers cycling through every color in rapid succession. She was terrified. Throughout the gallery, beings leaned forward. Some held their breath. Others whispered prayers in their native languages. Kelvin's voice filled the massive chamber. This court has deliberated extensively on both the facts of this case and the larger questions it raises. We have reviewed all testimony. We have examined legal precedents going back centuries. We have debated fundamental principles that form the foundation of galactic law. The High Arbiter paused, and those large silver eyes focused directly on James. James Carter, this court finds you guilty as charged. Gasps erupted throughout the courtroom. Several beings stood up in protest. Tessa's feathers flashed bright red. Her data pad slipped from her hands and clattered to the floor. In the gallery, some of the witnesses who had testified began shouting objections. Kelvin raised a hand for silence. The courtroom slowly quieted, though anger and disappointment hung in the air like smoke. You did violate the non-interference doctrine, Kelvin continued in that same measured tone. You did act without proper authorization. You did circumvent established diplomatic protocols. These facts are not in dispute. You have admitted them freely and without apology. Vycross looked satisfied for the first time in hours. The hegemony handlers in the gallery nodded to each other with grim approval. This was what they had wanted. Precedent established. Order maintained. However, that single word changed everything. The courtroom froze. This court also finds that the non-interference doctrine, as currently written and as currently applied to humanitarian crises, violates the founding principles of the Galactic Council. The courtroom exploded. Aliens were shouting. Some in celebration, others in fury. Kelvin spoke over the chaos, their voice somehow cutting through the noise. Specifically, the doctrine as applied contradicts our most fundamental principle: that the dignity and preservation of sentient life supersedes political convenience. A law that requires officials to watch sentient beings die while awaiting bureaucratic approval is not a just law. It is a betrayal of everything the Council was founded to protect. Vycross jumped to his feet. Your Honor, you cannot simply declare a Council law unjust. That exceeds this court's authority. You're overstepping. No, prosecutor, Kelvin replied with steel in their voice. That is precisely this court's authority. We exist to interpret whether laws align with the Council's foundational principles. We have found they do not. The non-interference doctrine requires immediate legislative review and comprehensive revision. One of the other judges, a Threnic named Quinn, leaned forward to speak. His multiple eyes focused on the courtroom. This court issues the following ruling. James Carter is found guilty under current law. However, his sentence is suspended indefinitely pending Council legislative review of the non-interference doctrine. The holographic displays lit up with dense legal language, but Quinn summarized in simpler terms. Furthermore, we are establishing what this court will call the Carter Principle. When established institutions demonstrably fail to protect sentient life in immediate crisis situations, and when proper channels would result in preventable deaths, individuals acting in genuine good faith to preserve life have not only the right but the moral obligation to act. This is insane. Vycross shouted. You're legalizing vigilantism. You're saying anyone can break any law if they think lives are at stake. No, Kelvin said firmly. We are establishing that conscience and compassion are not crimes. We are acknowledging what Mr. Carter has demonstrated for 40 years. That our institutions are imperfect. That our bureaucracies sometimes fail. And that until we improve them, we must allow space for individuals to act when those institutions fail their basic purpose. Another judge, elderly Velian, added clarification. This ruling comes with strict constraints. The Carter Principle applies only to immediate humanitarian crises where death or serious harm is imminent. It requires demonstrable institutional failure or unreasonable delay. It demands good faith action without personal benefit. It does not excuse violence beyond necessary self-defense. It does not permit theft for profit. It does not allow actions taken for political gain. It is a narrow exception for specific circumstances, Kelvin emphasized. Not a license for lawlessness, but it acknowledges a truth we have ignored too long. Sometimes the right thing to do is technically illegal. Sometimes following every rule means abandoning our values. Sometimes one person with the courage to act saves lives that entire governments were willing to sacrifice. The courtroom had descended into complete chaos. Representatives were accessing emergency communication channels, frantically reporting to their home governments. Some species were celebrating. Others were filing immediate protests and appeals. A Velian delegate stood up, her voice carrying over the noise. My government supports this ruling completely. We will push for immediate humanitarian protocols based on the Carter Principle. A KRYL military commander rose as well. The KRYL Confederation agrees. We have watched too many allies die while waiting for proper authorization. This addresses a fundamental flaw in our system. But several hegemony coalition members were already filing formal objections. Threats to withdraw from Council cooperation,